So welcome back, everyone, to another season for the High Noon Programming 2023. We have a new sound system. That gentleman needs a little more sound. Look at that. It's very flexible. And this actually, the sound system came from the Heinemann Foundation. So we've been struggling with sound, it seems like, for about 8 years. And we've tried all these ways to modify the sound. And I think we actually have a sound where you all can hear. We have this scroll thing. We don't know how to control it, or I should say I do not know how to control it. But hopefully it's not a distraction. It was from our reception last Thursday, which was to announce that we were re-accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. And that's one of 1,080 museums in the United States are accredited by the AAM. So we're one of 6 in the state of Montana. So anyway, we have some great programming coming up. We have in April 20, History of Chinese Experience in Montana with Dr. Mark Johnson from Notre Dame. May 18, we got Mary Murphy to come out of Bozeman. She's been kind of hiding for a long time. And she's doing her program Looking for Culinary Creativity in Montana's Historic Kitchens. On Thursday, June 15, we have Dr. Shane Doyle, the Crow historian, talking about the history of indigenous peoples in Yellowstone National Park. So, we have this great lithograph exhibit downstairs, and we want to learn more about Yellowstone. And so we have Dr. Shane Doyle in June, and in July we have Susan Barnett coming from the Cody Museum to talk about Thomas Moran and William Henry Jackson's photography and art that really helped establish the National Park in 1872. So, by the way, I'm Kevin Quaster, Executive Director of the museum, so sorry about that. Anyway, we're really happy to have another Bozemanite, well, not anymore. Dr. Jennifer Hill's research and writing focuses on childbirth, contraceptive, abortion, venereal disease, and healthcare in the American West, based on the belief that history is a powerful tool for understanding current controversies. Dr. Hill focuses on interpreting our shared human past in ways that inform contemporary reproductive issues. Jennifer Hill holds a PhD in American Studies and is currently Associate Teaching Professor at MSU. Jennifer works as an interdisciplinary scholar in the field of American Studies. I'm going to read this one sentence and I'll have a comment. When she is not researching, writing, or teaching, she can be found trail running, gardening, kayaking, or eating. The only thing we have in common is the eating part. But I would love to kayak, so gardening's okay. In her book, Birthing the West, which is the focus of today's topic, Jennifer investigates the history of childbirth in the United States, the American West, documenting a common yet often invisible reproductive past, utilizing an innovative methodology to address the history of public health, medical practices, and the development of state bureaucracy. She demonstrates the importance of recovering silenced voices and explains reoccurring patterns in American culture. Dr. Hill.
Thanks, Kevin. And I would say eating trumps it all, so we're okay as long as we can eat. Thank you all for being here. Get myself organized here. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic because this was exciting research for me to do, research on people who had lived vibrant, full lives and then who had poof, disappeared. For the most part, they weren't actively integrated into the historic record, and very few people talked about them, which you could say, well, that's a little bit strange. Whenever I speak to audiences, I mention that, at least to my knowledge, everyone here has a belly button. Our great commonality is the fact that we all entered the world through birth, and yet it is something that we rarely talk about as historians. And so my work depends on audiences, bringing these forgotten histories into remembrance means that I can't just talk about it with myself. I can't just write about it for myself. I need audiences to share it with, to bring this alive. And that is the role that you folks play today, so I am grateful to each and every one of you who is here. I will allow time for questions at the end. People always have fascinating questions. I'm always excited to hear what people's questions are, and I'm sure that some of you will have questions. Just to reassure you, I would love to hear them. We'll make sure that there is time for those. All right, so this is the book that I am talking about. People always ask me, how did you come to write this book? And I am a Western historian. My research is all about the American West, and in all of my travels across the American West, when I'm doing research, I kept coming across these stories about births, stories about delivery, stories about big babies, stories about all of these sorts of things. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Here's another one of these stories. And so I said, well, I don't know of anyone who's doing a lot of work on this. I'll start filing this stuff away. And what happened is that over the course of several years, it became obvious to me that these weren't just various anecdotes. They started overwhelming in number the quantity of the other research I was doing. So it occurred to me that this isn't just this sort of occasional stories. This was actually an important part of the Western narrative as a whole. And that's when I thought, oh, maybe I should be writing about a book about this instead of some of the other stuff that I was tracking down. So those other books are to come, but this one made its appearance first, in part because it was more fun to do, and because it also felt timely given issues around public health. This is at a time when public health departments were coming into play. So that's where the book came from, so to speak. I am not going to talk about several things today. There's a whole bunch I'm going to talk about, but I'll just tell you off the bat what I'm not going to talk about. First of all, I'm not going to talk a lot about methodology. When I'm with groups of historians, I always talk about this because people always ask, how do we tell the stories of people who are silenced, etc. And the methods that we use are really important. I'm more than happy to get into that during question time, but that's also something that for people who aren't historians sometimes doesn't get them very excited. So I'll leave that for the end if some of you are interested. I am also not going to talk about Native women, not because they're not important, they are desperately important, but because that is a story all on its own. So the book includes background on all of the existing textual sources that are available in terms of Indigenous history of childbirth. Indigenous history is incredibly rich. Native women had an extensive pharmacopoeia, all sorts of birthing traditions that now have been proven to be medically sound, some of them far more advanced than what white settler women were using at the time, but that's also a topic unto itself. And so what I'm talking about today and what the focus of this book is really settler women who were in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas from the mid-1800s all the way through about the 1930s, 1940s, when we see the widespread development of the hospital system in the area. Once again, happy to take questions on Native history. All right, so what was reproduction like? Well, I would say that first of all, when we think about reproduction in this part of the country, my claim is that we can't understand Western history without understanding reproduction, because the settler colonial aim, taking possession of the territory and putting it into service, could not happen without population. It also could not happen without certain cultural institutions like schools, churches, etc. And going from the picture on the left to the picture on the right is a physical manifestation of what is needed for that. You need people. And those people were brought into the area, obviously through immigration, but also through reproduction. And I need to always couch this in the sense that when we think of reproduction now, if we think about childbirth, usually people's first response is, oh, that's a medical event. And that is so very different than how people during this era saw it. They conceived of reproduction and childbirth as a social event, certainly with some medical consequences sometimes, but in the same way that when I go out to a meal, I don't, like eating, I have to think about eating here. When I go out to a meal, I don't think of it being a medical event, right? I think of it as a social event. Now, it becomes a medical event if I have food poisoning or if I choke, something like that. But that was similar to how people saw childbirth and reproduction. It was social, and it had an important cultural emphasis. So I'm going to walk you through just the typical perspective on the reproductive cycle and try to get us into the mindset of people at this time. There's wonderful things about reproduction that remain the same. We all get here through the same basic process, but the way it was culturally constructed is very different. So first of all, now, here we are in 2023, and for anyone who is contemplating pregnancy or is in their active reproductive years, there's a way to find out whether you are pregnant or not. You could take a pregnancy test. This was not the case for someone in 1872. You simply didn't know. Now, there were all sorts of physical signs, but for women who were coming to this part of the country, a great many of them were nutritionally deprived, were physically doing very demanding tasks, and so a lot of the physical signs, like a regular menstrual cycle, did not manifest themselves. So a lot of them were not menstruating on a regular basis, so they didn't have a missed period as an indicator that they were pregnant. And so because the pregnancy test didn't exist, there was this sense of all the way through those reproductive years of living life as being potentially pregnant. Because they didn't know if they were pregnant or if they were not, they had to assume, well, I might be pregnant. That was the default, which is a very, very different mental space than we inhabit now. So it's the first thing to think about. And then secondly, okay. So this is Lorenza Koch. She actually came with her husband Peter to Bozeman. If you've ever driven down Koch Street in Bozeman, these are the Koches. They were very important. And because we think of this era being one in which, women were potentially pregnant all the time, birth control options weren't, as available, certainly, as they are now, we think of women as being these happy reproducers because they really didn't have much of an option. But that simply was not the case. So even though motherhood was considered the social role for women to inhabit, that doesn't mean they were all happy about it. And Lorenza Koch is one historical example of that. When she became pregnant, she wrote her mother. We have the letters, and she talked about how very upset she was, how sad she was that she was entering this reproductive part of her life. And she didn't have any real options, but that doesn't mean that she was overjoyed about it. And that's one thing that's important to remember as we think about reproduction at this time, that there were a lot of women that weren't really all that thrilled about being pregnant. There's also the issue of miscarriage. So miscarriage rates are difficult to track even today because most miscarriages occur very early in pregnancy, and so it's really hard to tell whether a miscarriage occurred or not. This is certainly the same during this time period, and we don't have records, very many records at all. Certainly I came across a number of accounts in diaries, letters, etc., where women documented miscarriages, etc. But one of the rare sources that actually I could attach some data to was Catherine Broadhead. Catherine Broadhead ran a maternity home in Fairview, Montana. And maternity homes were these nifty things. They were homes that people would go to have babies. And these were incredibly common all across the state for a very short period of time. And I can go into the history of those more later on if people are interested. They were the pre-hospital. So they were there before the widespread use or public building of hospitals. And Catherine Broadhead ran one of these maternity homes. She was a midwife. She also had trained with a physician, so she did all sorts of giving of drugs and various procedures that she had been trained for. And her family actually made her records available to me. That's one of the ways I found out so much of this information is a lot of families had kept information from their grandmothers, great-grandmothers, great-aunts, etc. Catherine Broadhead had these medical records that she kept, and she documented the people that came to her for treatment for miscarriages. Now, once again, we have to remember these would be people who had miscarriages later on in pregnancy because they actually needed some help. From Catherine Broadhead's records, it looks as if miscarriage occurred, at least in the community of Fairview, with at least the regularity that it does now, but probably much more so. And the reason for that would be, once again, we have women who are in very physically challenging situations. The body reacts when there's not very many calories. Carrying a baby to term, much better for the survival of the human species than endangering the life of the mother. So miscarriage was certainly a part of reproductive experience in the mid to late 1800s all the way through the 1930s, 1940s, given the information that we have. And then, of course, pregnancy. So women experienced lots of pregnancies. I'm happy to talk about contraceptive methods here in a little while if you folks are interested in terms of questions. I can tell you there were some contraceptive methods available, nothing with the guarantees that we have now. And so women like Lucy Tinsley had a lot of kids, and the routine was to have a child about every 2 years, because given breastfeeding and recovery from childbirth, that was typically how they were spaced. And you can look back, frequently there will be either a miscarriage or a child that dies, etc. But the 2-year routine, obviously it didn't hold for absolutely everyone, but if we had to point to a pattern at this time, that's what we would say, is that people who were reproductively active were having babies about every 2 years. Lucy Tinsley is significant because she had 8 kids who all lived to adulthood, which was very unusual at this time. Lucy Tinsley is also the matriarch of the family. If any of you have ever visited the Museum of the Rockies and gone to their living history farm, that is the house that Lucy Tinsley inhabited with her kids. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, why was she so successful? Was she just genetically programmed to be good at childbearing? Possibly, we don't really know. But what we also know is that she came to Montana with a broad social support network. So she came with a lot of other Tinsley women. And that's what emerged for me over the course of doing this research, is the fact that we didn't just have individual women randomly reproducing all across the West with no connection whatsoever. There was actually an informal infrastructure of care that was operating. These women were caring for each other very effectively, given the alternatives of the time, to make sure that people did not deliver alone, to make sure that they had the support that they needed. And this infrastructure was very significant in creating the communities of the West. And so my contention is that we can't understand this region without understanding these birthing networks, that the birthing networks actually were significant in creating the ethos of the West, the community of the West, the kinds of connections that made this place home for so many people. Now, some of those connections, in fact, a lot of those connections occurred as part of these reproductive networks. So this is Mary Kastmeyer. She was a midwife practicing up in the Fort Benton area. And she's another source that I know about because her family shared her information with me. So Mary Kastmeyer asked all of the families that she delivered babies for to send her a picture of the infant. And she collected these pictures in a scrapbook. Now, one of the social networks that midwives and mothers were involved in was basically a sliding fee scale, so that no one had to worry about being able to pay for reproductive care. So midwives who were working all across the region were taking goods in trade. They were basically doing work on credit. Sometimes they just did it gratis. And there were a number of people that Mary Kastmeyer provided birthing services for that she said, don't worry about it, just send me a picture. The picture was the fee because people didn't have the funds sometimes to pay. And it's very significant looking back through her records. A lot of the pictures that are in that album to document those infants that she delivered were actually of older children. And the story goes, when I tracked down those information, was that they were very poor families who saved up over a number of years to be able to afford a photograph and then sent it back to Mary Kastmeyer years afterwards because they were so grateful. And that was their way of expressing their gratitude to her. I want to say something about the expertise involved in this informal healthcare system. So we have a wide range of knowledgeable midwives, some of whom called themselves midwives, and some of them who just called themselves helpers. Many of the immigrants who came to Montana and the Dakotas and Wyoming came from Northern European countries like Sweden, Denmark, etc. Those countries had state-sponsored midwifery programs for the most part. And so a great many of the immigrant women who were settling in this part of the country had gone to midwifery school and had their textbooks, had their birthing bags, had all of that, and actually had far more knowledge about the reproductive process than physicians in the area. Physicians had come to the business of childbirth relatively recently. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you were inviting a neighbor woman over to help you, the odds that she had been at a number of deliveries were very high. Given the social nature of childbirth, that she would have from her teen years on been involved in going and seeing these, recognizing what a normal birth looked like, seeing what people did when there were complications, etc. But then it was also highly possible that she had had extensive training. And so what we see is the provision of actually very experienced professional care in terms of the reproductive services that these women offered to each other. I will, in my litany of going through the reproductive cycle, there is very little information about menopause. People talked about the change, but in terms of treatment for it, that was usually passed down word of mouth. And because it wasn't a life and death matter, people were providing care to each other just on a friend-to-friend basis, not so much on a trained midwifery kind of basis. So it was something that was certainly talked about. And people frequently, when you look at, they called them sometimes receipt books, you would have people where they'd write their sourdough recipe and their bread recipe and their treatment for strep throat and what to do about the sheep that was coughing and also what to do about some sort of menopausal symptoms. So there were all sorts of not just recipes for food, but recipes for tonics, treatment, etc. And you come across comments and treatments for menopause in that context. All right, so this system that I mentioned that was informal, and I say it was informal because it wasn't sponsored by a government This was something that women created simply out of neighborliness and concern. It was dramatic in its effects. So I was able to find very few, less than 1%, of the births that I was able to statistically record happened with no attendance whatsoever. So it was actually quite effective at providing care. Now, what people were very concerned about was not prenatal care, because everyone went without. That wasn't something anyone talked about. You were just pregnant, and you tried to figure out when you would be due. You sort of guessed, and you tried to make sure you would have someone there. Sometimes you guessed right, sometimes you didn't, and someone had to hurry on over kind of at the last minute. But what women were most concerned about was having care during the postpartum period. And initially, when I started looking at this, I thought, what is the big deal? Why was everyone so concerned about this? But then if you start thinking about what people were doing, so many of these women had extensive responsibilities, both with livestock, with keeping a homestead going, and also with food provision, laundry, et cetera, et cetera. Their efforts, their whole family's business enterprise could tank very quickly if they could not keep up their responsibilities. And so they were absolutely adamant about locating postpartum help. And midwives actually did this. And so, for example, Mary Kastmeyer did, Catherine Broadhead did. So what you got when you asked a midwife to come and made arrangements was not just someone who was there for the delivery, but then someone who came back and brought a meal, someone who came and did laundry, someone who helped for at least 2 to 3 weeks after the delivery to help get mother and infant up and going again, to make sure that the whole operation kept going. So that is part of that infrastructure of care. The other thing that was part of that infrastructure of care was to be there not just in times of birth, but also in times of death and sickness. So there were several infants in Mary Kastmeyer's album who actually died at the age of 2 or 3 from various childhood illnesses. She would have been back there for that, taking a meal, being there to help lay out the baby, being there for the funeral, being there to help the family. So when you think about community building, these kinds of networks are absolutely critical because they provide the things that make people feel as if they're home. It's people who know you, people who care about you, people who understand the details of your lives. Then, in Birthing the West, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, I have to leave some drama that I don't cover so you folks are tempted to actually read the book, is what happens is we have the professionalization of medicine and the growth of health departments in the early 1900s. Now, because now, our experience of childbirth now is so geared around going to the doctor, we don't often think about the fact that this is a very recent development. So, as medicine attempted to regularize and make its educational standards consistent, because for a while you could, hang out your shingle as a doctor, and there were all sorts of physicians. There were allopathic physicians, which is what we think of now, but there were also homeopathic physicians, et cetera. You had a huge list. You had phrenologists, all sorts of medical professionals that had varied training. A lot of these people who called themselves doctors had never seen a birth, aside from their own, probably, which they didn't have a very clear memory of. So they didn't have a lot of background in childbirth. And as physicians professionalized, this is in the late 1800s, it became obvious that they needed a better business model. They needed regular work. Well, what is more regular at this time than childbirth? And so they tried to get in on the birthing business. And this was hard. We see in professional medical records, in their journals, etc., all sorts of comments about the midwife problem. Now, what was the midwife problem? The midwife problem was that midwives were preferred by pregnant women because they were cheaper and they provided much more comfortable service. If you think about the social mores of the time, being examined by someone of your same gender was far more comfortable. And then they were also, when you're dealing with immigrant populations, when you're in the midst of labor, as someone who has had 3 children, I can tell you that I would not want to be trying to speak a second language while I was pushing a baby out. You want to be talking with someone who speaks your language literally. And so the immigrant status, the fact that if you were from Finland, you could get a Finnish midwife and you could speak Finnish when you were in the middle of labor. You didn't have to try to speak English. And so this was a problem that physicians identified, and they started a public relations campaign to encourage people to choose physician care over midwifery care. And this had all sorts of nationalistic overtones. Basically, the claim was that if you want to be American, you can demonstrate your patriotism and your American loyalty by having your baby with an American doctor in your American hospital, all right? So this happened over a several decade time period. It happened much more slowly in this part of the country. That's why I was even able to collect all this information, because in urban areas, this transition to doctors and into hospital birth happened earlier. So 1930s, 1940s, we still have practicing midwives in Montana. People like Catherine Broadhead, who had their maternity homes, etc. If you were looking in more urban areas or areas in the East, this transition would have already taken place. This was not happening then. This is Bertha Coomer. She lived in Townsend. Her husband ran a brewery there. And one of the things that people always ask me when I talk about childbirth is, how did people deal with the fear of death? You know, that there's a sense that women were always afraid of dying in childbirth. Well, what this was prior to the 1900s, it was actually far more unusual for people to talk about this incredible fear of death, because life was dangerous, and childbirth was not horrifically more dangerous than a lot of other things that they did. But what happened was, and this was Bertha Coomer's situation, once women were encouraged to have their babies in hospitals or with doctors, this is pre-hand washing. And one of the reasons why physicians found it very practical to have women have their babies in the hospital is they could do other things. Childbirth is a rather long, laborious process. And if you're going out to someone's house, you just end up sitting around for a day or so. Whereas if you have them come to you in the hospital, you can do a lot of other things. You can examine cadavers. You can treat someone's gangrenous foot. You can do all sorts of other things. The problem is that doctors weren't washing their hands between treating someone's infection and examining the birth canal of a pregnant woman or a woman who was just delivering. This was routine. It wasn't as if there were, evil doctors out there, but this was just the care of the time. And so what we have is this huge spike in what is called puerperal fever, childbed fever. This is what women started dying of. And Bertha Coomer ended up dying of this. She had, it was her 3rd pregnancy. She delivered the baby and everything appeared fine, but then within about 10 days, she was dead from an infection. And we don't know exactly where the infection came from, but she was treated by a doctor who was treating other people who had various infections. And so this, when we look at the health department statistics in the early 1900s, we see a spike in maternal death, which was noteworthy at the time. People were very alarmed about it with good reason, because all of a sudden they're trying to encourage women to come to the hospital because this is the way we do it now, because we're Americans and this is all very important. And then women were dying and they couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. Well, fortunately, The advent of antibiotics helped with that. And then in retrospect, we know that basic cleanliness really made a difference. The reason why midwives weren't the purveyors of this kind of infection is they didn't do that kind of stuff. They only did childbirth, and they would come and stay at one woman's house for the birth. So there was no risk factors, or very few risk factors involved. And so we didn't have that kind of level of infection and death. So I want to make sure and allow plenty of time for questions here. I'm always interested in not just what interesting history is out there, but what does it tell us? What can we learn from it? What application does this have for us today? So first and foremost, I would say, is that silent stories can be told. This happens to be my great-grandmother, who came to eastern Montana in the early 1900s. Her first pregnancy, she went to Ekalaka, Montana to deliver my grandmother. The one physician there at the time was busy playing poker and was not interested in coming over to her delivery. And so a midwife in the area helped her. And my great-grandmother said she was never going to do that again. And so for her second and third deliveries, she actually went back to Missouri, where her extended family was, because she wanted that social network to help her through that process. So, conclusions. Stories like these can be told. It is very possible, it's a lot of work, but we can excavate these voices. We can find these stories and record them. Second, relational connections are the things that create meaning. So in history, we spend a lot of time looking at things like submarine warfare, etc. Not that those things aren't important, but they're not. I don't want to talk about submarine warfare to the exclusion of things that are meaning-making. And it is the relational connections that frequently define the stuff of people's lives. And so these kinds of topics are particularly important because they tell us about the human experience. They tell us about what it means to be humans. And then the importance of language. What happened, once again, I'll just allude to this, but as I mentioned, that midwife problem that physicians identified, with the growth of public health, initially public health departments partnered with midwives to reduce maternal mortality. But very quickly, there was a bit of a prestige game happening, and health departments instead threw their lot in with physicians. And midwives were quickly removed from the public health scene. The profession did not entirely disappear, but it was severely dampened. And much to the unfortunate cause of maternal health. And so protecting the sorts of public health things that we need to talk about, like the importance of women's bodies, the importance of health care, those kinds of things need to receive front and center attention, not just historically, but as we then look at, well, what does this mean now? What does it mean in terms of caring for each other now? So, this is a quick run through of a very important history. I would say that it was my great pleasure to interact with so many of these fascinating stories. These were people that helped create the country that I call home in terms of the Montana spaces, and I have been so grateful to be able to listen to their stories and to talk about them. So thank you. Any questions? Kevin.
If we have stories that we want to share with you, how would we do that?
Email. Yeah. Feel free to get a hold of me. Okay. Yes, what's been interesting in talking about this book is I keep, people are always approaching me afterwards and, oh, I want to tell you about this. And Yes, it's wonderful. I would love to, at some point, create a whole repository at the Historical Society or something like that with all of these stories. But at this point, I am the repository, I think, to a certain extent. But yes, I'm always happy to hear stories. Question? Yeah?
What's the difference between a midwife and just a regular midwife?
Okay, so the question is, what's the difference between a midwife and just someone who's helping? Great question. And you know what? That is something that people really struggled with. So women who had gone to school, like in Northern Europe, and they actually got a midwifery diploma, and they were hired by the government to do midwifery services, those women were really clear about calling themselves midwives. So on the census, when people talked to them in newspaper ads, they would take out ads in the paper, they would say things like skilled midwifery services, etc. But there were a lot of people who lived in this part of the country who felt uncomfortable calling themselves midwives because they hadn't been to school for it, because they didn't have a diploma. And so they would sometimes, especially after they had assisted at 50 births or something like that, they would say, well, you know what, I'm going to call myself a midwife now. But because there was no sort of licensing agency, there wasn't an official time at which you became a midwife if you hadn't gone to school somewhere else. And so it was something that people struggled with in terms of whether they were going to call themselves a midwife or just call themselves a friend. And it came with varying levels of expertise and knowledge. Good question. Yeah.
It may seem obvious, but why has this been ignored for all these years? And there are, the study of social history has been around for a long time, but the whole issue of birthing and its impact has been ignored. Do you have any thoughts about why that's true, or is it the usual?
Do I have thoughts? Yes. So the question is, why has this not been documented to date, to a certain extent? So the social history has been around for a long time. It is certainly, this is not the first time anyone has said we should look at reproduction. So I obviously, the collection of this material, stories about marginalized populations, stories about women, stories about children, are not documented. Stories about poor men are not documented in the same way that are, people who, because we rely on a written record, and who is it that ends up writing things down? People who have people write about them. And so we're getting a very narrow segment of the population in our archival records. But the other reason is that something that seems so ordinary and everyday doesn't have one collecting agency. So in the book, I tell the story of all this research I did. Usually I had kids along, which was really interesting. And I would go to archives and I would say, oh, I'd like to see what you have on childbirth or reproduction. And well-meaning archivists would always give me this blank look, like, we don't really have anything on that. And then I would say, okay, well, let me look through your oral histories. I would start looking at different sources. And the information was all there. It wasn't as if people never talked about it. There was an effort in the 1970s and 1980s to record the stories of pioneers because they were all getting old and dying. And a lot of these were women because they lived longer than men, etc. And even when they weren't asked questions about childbirth, they talked about it because it was important to them. And so there was this information there, but it hadn't been collected underneath one umbrella. And so it is one of those things where, because it is so common and so woven into the fabric of everyday life, it doesn't get a separate designation. And so it requires this, it's a very different process. Instead of going and looking at one data set or one historical collection somewhere, I had to take pieces all over the place to get this giant pile of information.
As a pioneer, do you see others now interested in what you seem to have started?
So the question would be, are there others? Yes. Absolutely. And I would hope that there would be more and more. It's a fascinating topic. I mentioned maternity homes briefly. There has been almost none, I shouldn't say none, but almost no research done on maternity homes in Montana. It's a rich topic. So there's no lack of information in other people doing this work. There is a lack of funding, I would mention, because people don't usually think about, you can get a grant to study X, Y, or Z, but getting a grant to study the history of childbirth is really hard to come by. And so it's not a lack of information, but the fact that they're getting the infrastructure to support that becomes challenging. Good. In the back.
Is it true that women, one of the reasons childbirth is spaced about 2 years apart is because women nursed babies for about 2 years, and nursing hormones would not allow you to become pregnant?
Sure. So the question is, what about the 2-year spacing? And yes, nursing reduces fertility. Does not mean that you can't get pregnant. And so that 2-year spacing, first of all, during the recuperation period, people would frequently abstain from sex because they wanted to make sure that that postpartum period was safely traversed and everyone was doing okay. So there was usually a period where they weren't having sex. And then not just the caloric requirements of their lifestyle, but then birthing would help reduce their fertility. Absolutely. And as usual, there's all sorts of anecdotal counterexamples of, children who are born 11 months apart or stuff like that. So it was never a sure thing. But absolutely, the reduced fertility because of a physically challenging lifestyle and breastfeeding both contributed to that 2-year spacing. Absolutely.
That's probably a subject of another book, but I'm curious about the role of abortion in the whole birthing realm, and also the role of the midwives in abortions.
So the question is, what about abortion, and what about midwives in abortion? So abortion is actually a fascinating topic. If we can, unfortunately, whenever I teach on abortion, I always have to tell students, let's try to drop the politics of it, because that's a very recent overlay. Abortion has been around forever, as long as birth has been around, from a pharmacological perspective, pharmacopoeia, herbs, etc. And so most midwives knew how to use herbs to, and the phrase people frequently used was restore the menses, was to cause someone to menstruate regularly again. And so there were any number of plants, herbs, etc., that a lot of midwives were familiar with to help bring regularity to the reproductive system. What happened was, as you're looking at a whole host of people who are immigrating, carrying seeds with you was certainly something people did. But if you're immigrating and then you're relocating and then you're relocating, you don't have people with as extensive a gardens initially, at least, or as much stuff that they can just go out and get. That was one of the real tragedies for Indigenous women, was that they had this whole system of herbs, plants, etc., that they were very well versed in using, but then being forcibly relocated to reservations meant that they didn't have access to a lot of the stuff that they typically used. So when we look at abortion historically, it's almost always using natural aids very early on in pregnancy, when we know from miscarriage rates, etc., pregnancy early on is less well established, shall we say, than later on. And it is much easier to use herbal aids at that point to end a pregnancy than it is later on. So I didn't come across midwives who did what we would now call surgical abortions. That was not something that was typically part of the midwifery practice, but a great many midwives knew how to dramatically reduce fertility, sometimes really dramatically reduce fertility, and certainly made that information available to their clients. Once again, though, we have to remember that this is an oral tradition. And so over the years, as abortion became more and more politicized, that was information that people were less and less willing to share, and less willing to say, oh, I knew how to do that, and this is how we did it. In the same way that contraception had such a cloud over it. The Comstock Act in 1875 forbid any sharing of that information, made it a federal crime. And so people had all sorts of contraceptive methods that they talked about, but even when you look at those interviews with pioneer women in the 1970s, 1980s, even when interviewers asked them, so what did you use for contraception? People would not talk about it. These were, women in their 80s. It wasn't as if someone was going to think shamefully of them, but the perception of them as being bad girls versus good girls was so strong that women would say over and over, well, we just took care of things, or we just knew what to do. They felt so uncomfortable talking about specific methods because of the cultural onus that was put on it. So there's continuing silences in the historic record in a lot of ways. Great question. Anyone else? Yes?
When did formal training come to this part of it, like it was in the Northern European countries? When did midwifery be a curriculum, or?
Actually, that's a whole nother dramatic story that I can tell you about. Actually, that was the subject of my dissertation. And Montana is actually very noteworthy in that regard. So what happened is, in Montana, it became illegal, meaning it wasn't illegal, it wasn't on the books as being not something you could do, but it also did not have specific state sanction. And so there were fewer and fewer midwives as medicine was pushing to take over the realm of birth. And then what happened with second wave feminism and the pushback against medical control is that then in the 1960s, 1970s, and I should emphasize this is 1960s, 1970s, what happened was people started requesting home births, and there were still some people who were practicing in Montana, but there was also a lot of people who would go to places like California, Arizona, sometimes in the South. The midwifery knowledge actually was preserved in marginalized communities because many doctors did not want to treat Black women, Native women, Hispanic women. And so they had to have their own healthcare practitioners. So those traditions of midwifery were kept alive in a lot of those communities because traditional doctors would not treat them. And so then what happened with the resurgence of midwifery is a lot of times people went back to those communities for training. And so actually in 1989, there was a woman who was charged by the Montana Medical Board for practicing medicine without a license. Her name is Dolly Browder. She's still alive today. And she was taken to trial in Missoula for being a home birth provider. And people across Montana were so upset that they took it to the legislature. And surprisingly enough, in the Montana legislature, in the 1989 and 1991 sessions, it passed in large measure because legislators said, but my great aunt delivered babies, and my cousin was born down the road, etc. So the fear factor that professionalized medicine presented about, we can't have midwives, had way less impact in Montana because the tradition of home birth was actually still so recent. So Montana, I believe, was the 9th state to legalize midwifery, as in put it on the books, which happened in the formal procedures were part of the 1991 legislative session in Montana. Mm-hmm. Good. How are we doing on time, Kevin?
I think pretty well. What do you think? Oh, we're doing right on.
Okay.
We can take one more question.
One more question, if anyone has one. Or not.
I guess maybe it's following just what you were talking about, but were some of the midwives then hired by early hospitals to work in the hospitals? Or was there a separation?
So Kevin says, were some of the midwives hired in early hospitals? No. because this was the divide that then happened. And this is the tragic part, is there was so much knowledge and information and expertise there that could have been made use of. But because of the competition business-wise between organized medicine and midwifery, that was seen as being something that they did not want to happen. And so there were some midwives, like Mary Kastmeyer that I mentioned. She actually had admitting privileges in the hospital, but just on her own. She also helped other doctors, so she collaborated with some physicians, and I documented this across the region, but it was on a very specific case-by-case basis. Sort of on the overlay of professional medicine was, we don't want to because they're the competition. We want them not to be in business. And so that's why women for a while ran these maternity homes until there were then local hospitals. And at that point, like Catherine Broadhead, she closed up shop because there was a local hospital that, and in her case, I don't have a record of any threats, but there were plenty of other places in Montana and the Dakotas and Wyoming where there was a push by a local hospital to say, listen, you haven't been licensed by the state, you need to shut down. And so there was a removal of competition in that situation. Yeah.
Well, and male doctors at that time, we didn't even have female doctors. Now you have midwives with more knowledge on that particular deal. I think it was more of a male threat because the female doctors were gradually starting to make their way in. But no, now you have midwives that know the female water benefit. Yeah, it would be almost detrimental. You're admitting that she's an equal or has enough knowledge.
Right, and then the whole question of the gendered aspect was absolutely there. We can't ignore that in any way. And that was really one of the, when we look at the institutional angle of it, midwives never organized. Why? Well, they didn't see themselves as a profession, and they didn't have access to the halls of power, so to speak, so they didn't push back. And so as we look at this history, in addition to looking at the whole idea of language and power, as we look at bodies, whether they are gendered bodies or racialized bodies or aged bodies, however we want to put that, we have to acknowledge that in terms of all these other cultural things that are going on as we look at this. And so absolutely, the gendered aspect is there without a question. Good.
Thank you so much. I did want to mention there are 4 of your books for sale yet. We have 4 of the...
And I brought a couple extra in,
okay,
so I have overflow.
If you do want to purchase one, you can go to Danette will take care of it, right, Danette? Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. You've been a great audience.